Throughout history, there have been many women who became terrible murderesses, executioners, and torturers. Some became incredibly powerful, such as Elena Ceausescu, who, alongside her husband, were overthrown as the dictators of Romania, and they paid the ultimate price for their betrayal of their own people. But during World War II, there were some concentration camp guards who became known for their terrible crimes, as women such as Irma Grazer or Maria Mandel were later sent to the gallows for their shocking actions against people who were then driven into the gas chambers. In this documentary, we look at 5 of history's most brutal women who were condemned to death and were executed. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Elena Ceausescu was born on the 7th of January 1916, and no one would have imagined what she would become one day, as she was born into a peasant family in what was once known as the region of Wallachia. Her father was a farmer, but Elena was not the most well-educated girl, and after school she worked in Bucharest as a lab assistant, and she worked inside of a factory. It was inside this job that she began to develop an interest in politics, and she then became a member of the Romanian Communist Party in 1939, and whilst part of the Bucharest group, she met a 21-year-old man named Nicolae Ceausescu. The couple fell in love, but Nicolae would later believe that he never looked at another woman following his first meeting with Elena. However, their relationship was rocky, as he was locked up in prison a number of times, but the couple did get married on the 23rd of December 1947. Following the communist seizure of power in Romania, Elena then got a job as a secretary inside of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but her husband was a senior ranking member of the party, and he became the general secretary, and in this role Elena kept her husband company as he went on visits to other countries and diplomatic missions. She went with him to China in 1971. She was a supporter of Chairman Mao's wife, and she wanted to be like her. But then Elena became a member of the Central Commission on Social Economic Forecasting, and she was then elected to being a full member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. She had a number of different roles inside of the government. But then as the years went on, Elena Ceausescu began to rise to become the second most powerful person inside of Romania after her husband, and she was a woman who was idolised by many other women across the land. She was seen as the mother of the nation, and Elena Ceausescu was not the most endearing woman. She was very vain, and was worried about how she looked in media appearances, and she was worried about her nose to the point where she controlled photographs of her to show her not in profile. She was more bothered about her appearance at times than her people. However, despite the power and rise of the Ceausescus, they would have a huge crash and a huge fall from grace that led to their execution. In the 1980s, there was a lot of tension within different sections of Romanian society and was directed towards the dictator and his wife. On the 16th of December 1989, the Hungarian minority inside the city of Timisoara had a protest regarding the attempts by Ceausescu's leadership and government to evict and deport a Hungarian priest named Laszlo Tokes. The government claimed he was inciting hatred and whipping up furore, and they wanted him out. However, that evening the protest spread to a huge extent, and soon the root cause of the protest was forgotten, and the target of the uprising was the Ceausescus. Many protesters took to the streets and they tried to set fire to buildings, and the police would fire tear gas and use their water cannons on the rebels. The police attacked and beat up violently some of those protesting, and the group then began to march around the city, but they were met by members of the military. Things continued the following day, and protests resumed, and the protesters broke into the Communist District Committee building, and they destroyed much of the administrative equipment. But then the full-blown army was sent in by the Ceausescus to bring things to an end, and they sent in the tanks. There was shooting heard from Liberty Square around the city, and a lot of heavy equipment was used against the protesters. It was as if civil war was breaking out on the streets of Romania, and Nicolae then left the country to go and do government business with Iran, and he left Elena to deal with the revolution. She was not in the mood to negotiate, and martial law was declared, and she brought in a curfew. But the protesters refused to conform, and because of this the military fired at them, and some were killed. Elena Ceausescu then decided to send other government officials in to deal with the protests, but these were more lenient, They even agreed to free some of the protesters who had been arrested. On the 20th of December, Elena's husband returned from Iran, and he then made an ill-fated speech which went terribly wrong. Many of the crowd who witnessed it, around 100,000 people, had been government plants and stooges brought in to make the Ceausescus seem more popular. But he was out of touch, as was Elena, and they did not seem to want to deal with the demands of the crowd. Ceausescu continued to speak, but the crowd jeered him. Then fireworks and gunshots were heard, and the crowd tried to disperse as they heard that security forces had been shooting at those who were protesting, as a full-blown revolution was now in full swing. The speech of Nicolae Ceausescu, with Elena stood by his side, was shown around the nation and the world, as was the fact they were shown retreating and looking shell-shocked, and they were bundled back into the government building. It was not a good look for the couple who were seen cowering, but the crowd then began to become more riotous, and there were chants aimed at the Ceausescus, claiming they were criminals who deserved to be put to death. But many more people joined in, and special forces were sent in, and the crowd was shot at again by the army. There were bodies in the streets and many casualties, and some were beaten to death and were even stabbed by pro-government forces. Some protesters were even ran over, as an armoured personnel carrier was driven at speed at the crowd, and the police continued to brutalise and batter anyone they saw. There was a lot more shooting throughout the night. But for Elena Ceausescu, she remained loyal to her husband, and she must have known that things were coming to a sharp end for her and her husband. She was also a big target for the unrest, and there was a lot of anger directed specifically towards her. Their economic policies had caused ruin inside of the country, and the people were forcing change. But in the morning of the 22nd of December, the Ceausescus then made the decision to wait a few hours to try and escape, and this would be a fateful decision. At 7 a.m, Elena specifically realised that there were now large groups of others heading to Bucharest to join in with the revolution, and despite fleeting attempts to curb the outrage, such as banning large groups, there were dozens of thousands inside of Bucharest. But the Ceausescus were turning on their own, as at 9:30 a.m, the defence minister it's believed was executed on Nicolae's orders, as he was refusing to shoot at the protesters. But then Elena and her husband tried to flee and tried to get to the roof of the building they were on to escape. But at the same time the protesters had broken into the building. They were quickly scaling the floors, and as the Ceausescus made their way over towards a helicopter that was there to rescue them and get out of the city, the protesters got onto the roof, and they were metres away from Elena and Nicolae Ceausescu. The pilot of the helicopter saw the protesters coming, and he quickly got the dictator and his wife out, but the couple were white with fear, and the pilot claimed that there wasn't enough space. Elena Ceausescu and I were squeezed in, between the chairs and the doors. We were only supposed to carry 4 passengers, we had 6. The pilot then dropped the couple with a few bodyguards in Snagov, as he claimed a revolution had erupted and there was nothing more he could do. Shortly after this, the Ceausescus were arrested after trying to take cars to get out of the region, and they were then brought to the Targovist garrison military compound. They were briefly held under arrest before a trial could be assembled. This occurred very quickly, and the trial of Elena Ceausescu and her dictator husband lasted just an hour, and they were not allowed proper legal representation. Elena tried her best to defend herself, but she knew what was going to happen, and she would be vicious with her words to the courtroom and the mock trial. The couple were accused of the genocide of 60,000 people and in organising armed forces to shoot against civilians. They were also accused of destroying public property and damaging buildings, as well as bringing the Romanian economy to its knees. The Ceausescus were found guilty of all the charges, and they were then sentenced to death. There was no appeal, and the Ceausescus believed that the court was illegal, and that their death sentence was not justified or legally standing. Elena Ceausescu was to be executed alongside her husband by a firing squad, being shot days after the Romanian Christmas Revolution had broken out. It was a quick demise, and Elena and Nicolae at 4 p.m. were brought outside the military barracks on Christmas Day 1989. The execution was performed by a firing squad of paratroopers, but hundreds of people had appealed to become one of those who shot the dictator and his wife. But as they were led up against a wall, Nicolae said, "We could have been shot without having this masquerade," but Elena would be much stronger in her words. She screamed, "You sons of dogs," as her arms were tied by 4 soldiers and she struggled, and she was forced outside the barrack wall with her husband. But Nicolae Ceausescu sang in his final moments, but Elena screamed. The executioners then quickly fired their weapons, so quick in fact that television cameras could not capture the whole of the execution, as the executioners littered the former dictator and his wife with their machine gun bullets. It was claimed that the pair had been struck by around 100 bullets. Elena Ceausescu, when she was executed against the side of the barrack building, was 73 years old, and she was the only woman to have ever been executed by the modern state of Romania. She was the most powerful woman across the land, and she wanted to be seen as a respected world leader, but alongside her husband, the pair ruined the nation. She was seen as a tyrant and a brutal woman who needed ousting out of power, and on Christmas Day 1989, she was executed in a brutal manner by members of the armed forces who had once been loyal to her, but they were now loyal to the revolution. Anna Ans van Dijk was born on the 24th of December 1906. She was the daughter of Jewish parents, Aaron van Dijk and Katje Bin. It's assumed that she had a relatively normal upbringing, and in 1927, at the age of 21, she married Bram Quirido. However, within 8 years they'd separated, and following this she had a relationship with another woman, and then opened up a shop in Amsterdam. Her shop was for headwear or hats, however dark times for the Netherlands were on the horizon. On the 10th of May 1940, the Germans invaded the neutral Netherlands, and within 5 days of the army rolling into the country, the armed forces had surrendered. Rotterdam had been heavily bombed during the attack, and the royal family quickly left the country, fleeing to London. The invaders placed the country under immediate German occupation, and the swift invasion shocked many, especially because of the neutrality of the Netherlands. The armed forces defending the Netherlands quickly folded, as they had old weapons and equipment and poor numbers of these, and they were caught out by shock. Their weapon systems in place were from the First World War and had not been updated. They had a very small amount of armoured cars and tankettes and could not compete with the rapid assaults of the Wehrmacht. Rotterdam was blitzed by Luftwaffe bombers, and around 25,000 homes were destroyed, with hundreds killed. The locals pressurised the garrison commander of the city to surrender. The Dutch High Command was shocked by the large-scale bombing, and they ordered the army to surrender. Life inside of the occupied Netherlands got tougher as the war went on, with large-scale food shortages. Hitler thought highly of the Dutch people, and he considered them fellow Aryans. There were attempts to appease the population and to sway them to the National Socialist ideology, and the leaders of the Netherlands eased on the repression of the civil population. However, for Jews, they were persecuted heavily inside of the country. The Nazis began early to deport Jews to different concentration camps, and the Dutch people saw this and began to strike. Mass deportations continued, with Jews being sent to transit camps before being sent to concentration camps further away. Jews were forced to wear the Star of David, and the survival rates of the Dutch Jews was around 27%. Now, as mentioned, there was a significant degree of collaboration with the Nazis. Between 20,000 and 25,000 Dutch men, for example, joined the Heer, or the Waffen-SS, with whole brigades of Dutch soldiers fighting for the Nazi cause. Some even saw action on the Eastern Front, and even fought in the Netherlands themselves. But there were very shameful parts of collaboration. Women who collaborated or slept with German soldiers were often forced into ordeals of public humiliation, having their heads shaved and being painted with swastikas. Ans van Dijk was one collaborator who sold her soul to the Nazis. Her hat business and shop was closed down by the Nazis in 1941, as they sought to seize all Jewish property in Amsterdam, and Jews were forbidden across the country to own businesses and to work inside of retail shops. There were other restrictions on them. Because of the closure, Van Dijk was left out of work, but being Jewish herself, she must have feared for her life at some point. It's alleged that to make money she began to sell goods where she could, and she also allegedly helped Jews to find hiding places. However, in January 1943, she was forced to hide from the Nazis to escape deportation. On Easter Sunday 1943, she was arrested by the SD and Detective Peter Schaap of the Office of Jewish Affairs of the Amsterdam Police after she was caught. During her interrogation and interview, to avoid deportation and to secure her freedom, Van Dyck decided to switch over and to collaborate. She agreed to help the SD to find Jews hiding in different places, and she agreed to work for them as a Jew hunter for her own safety. She began to infiltrate different circles, and she would offer help to Jews inside of Amsterdam, lying to them that she could help them to secure safe hiding places, and also provide them with false papers. She did this a number of times, and she managed to trap at least 145 people, and it's estimated that this number was even higher. In a horrific show of how sick she really was, she even managed to lure her own brother and other family members, and then they were turned over to the Nazis. Of those at least 145, it's estimated that at least 85 of the people snared by Hans van Dyck were murdered inside of concentration camps. However, other estimates have put her betrayal even higher, saying that she was responsible for turning over around 700 Jews to the Nazis. There have even been suggestions that Hans van Dyck may have been the one who found out about Anne Frank's secret annex, and that it was her who provided the information for the Gestapo to raid the annex and for the Frank family and the other hiders to be seized. She could have been the one behind the death of Anne Frank. She continued to turn over Jews to the Germans, but after the Second World War she was arrested. She had moved from Amsterdam to The Hague and was arrested at her friend's house on the 20th of June 1945. She was interrogated by Dutch police and was charged with 23 counts of treason against the people of her nation. Ans was brought to trial on the 24th of February 1947 and was brought in front of a judge and a courtroom. During her trial, she claimed that she had acted and agreed to only help the Germans to save her own life, stating that if she did not agree to help the SD and the Nazis, then she would have been sent to a concentration camp and would have been killed. She said this was the only reason why she did it, denying she was a Nazi, but amazingly she confessed to all 23 counts of treason. It was obvious what Hans van Dyck's sentence would be, as she was key to the murder of those men, women and children she handed over. Without her, they would not have been killed. Hans van Dyck for her actions was sentenced to death. She tried to appeal her conviction, pleading that without her turning over Jews, then she would have been killed herself. However, this went to the Special Court of Appeals. She even requested to the Queen Wilhelmina for a royal pardon, but this was again rejected, confirming her death sentence. On the 14th of January 1948, Hans van Dyck was brought from her prison to Fort Bijlmer, and the night before her execution, she was baptised and joined the Roman Catholic Church. She also wrote a number of goodbye letters, including one to a nun who visited her in jail. However, early in the morning she was brought out to what looks like a moat of the fort or a ditch surrounding a wall. Next to the wall were sandbags to ensure that bullets did not ricochet, and as she was brought into the ditch, she was led out to a post. She was then tied to this stake, and her hands and legs were also secured to ensure that Van Dyck could not escape. Over her head, a black cap was placed to ensure that she could not see her final moments. Opposite her was a firing squad who were then given a signal to get ready. The firing squad then, once the signal was given to fire, fired straight into Hans van Dyck. Her execution was one which can be viewed as slightly controversial, as she was Jewish herself, and it's clear that but for her collaboration, chances are that she would have been killed inside a concentration camp. However, what she didn't have to do was to take her role as a snitch for the SD to the level that she did, as for her actions, dozens were sent to their deaths inside some of the worst and most evil places the world has ever seen. Irma Grazer was born on the 7th of October 1923 inside of a small village named Rechten. It was a very rural upbringing for her, and she was raised around 50 miles north of Berlin. Her father, Alfred, was a farmer, and her mother took her own life in 1932 when she was 9 years old, and it was believed the marriage problems that she had with her husband may have led to this. But this left Irma and her 4 siblings without a mother, but her father was considered a man who regularly visited church, but he was very strict and stern with his children, and he often beat them. But he was a man who had a lot of bad feelings towards the Nazis and the rise of Hitler, and he banned his daughters from joining the League of German Girls, the Nazi youth group for young women, where they were taught how to be a housewife and a mother. But Irma and her sister Helene joined the group, against her father's wishes, and she became brainwashed by the Nazis, and she indulged in many of their policies. Irma began her indoctrination at the age of 10 when Hitler came into power, and her father had no choice over this, as at the time Nazi education was introduced in all elementary schools. Irma would become an ardent Nazi even at a young age, and at the age of 14 she left school after leaving home. She then worked as a farmhand for 6 months, before working in Lucien, in a shop as a retail sales clerk. She may have left home due to the rift which was opening up between her and her father, as he was disgusted by Irma's influence inside of the Nazi party, and how she was beginning to venerate Hitler. Irma, though, was a girl who was not considered the most violent at a young age, as she would often run away from fights and not get involved in them. But at some point she changed completely. In 1939 she went to study nursing, but she went to do this at the Hohenlyschen Hospital, a place where SS members would go to convalesce, around 20 miles from her hometown. This was where many top-ranking Nazis would go to be treated, and she trained, it's believed, under Karl Gebhardt, who would during the Second World War be known as a disgusting and evil doctor who performed shocking medical experimentation. He too would later be executed for his crimes, but it's believed that Irma may have been party to some of these experiments and may have watched as she tried to become a nurse. Whilst here it's likely she became further indoctrinated with the SS also, but she apparently was not good enough to be a nurse, and it was said she was best fit for other lines of work. She was around 17 at the time, but Irma then spoke to one of Gebhardt's friends at Ravensbrück, an all-female concentration camp. She went here for work in April 1941 and was told to come back in 6 months when she was 18. In the meantime she worked at a dairy farm and as a machinist, but she then went back to Ravensbrück and she joined the SS as an SS Aufseherinnen, or a female concentration camp guard. Women were asked to work in this line of employment from all over Germany, and around 2,500 would serve during the Second World War. Irma had to pass a number of exams, and she was also asked questions to ensure she was a Nazi and a strong one, who knew about the party and the race laws. She then was hired to train as a concentration camp guard, and she went through 3 weeks of hard and difficult training. On one of her first days she actually apologised to a prisoner who stepped out in front of her, and this was deemed not good enough, and she was then told how to brutally deal with inmates and how to not be polite to them. She around this time began to have relations with the SS male officers at the camp, and it was said that it appeared that all Aufseherinnens, married or unmarried, had one or more constant SS lovers. She would have indulged in the drinking bouts and parties that the SS had in the evening, but after 3 weeks she was trained. She then went to participate in many inmate beatings at Ravensbrück, and each month she was making 54 Reichsmarks in salary. She was trained by other sadists, but at the age of 19 it was time for her to move on. She received orders that she was going to be transferred to Auschwitz-Birkenau, near to Krakow. Before this move she went home, and Irma visited her father, and whilst wearing her full SS uniform, she had a huge argument with him. Her father allegedly struck her during this, and he then told her never to come home. But when she got to Auschwitz, Irma Grazer was assigned to the women's camp at Birkenau, and this was the main extermination part of the site where thousands were killed in the gas chambers. She had a number of duties there, including commanding the gardening squad, working on the telephones, and even being in control of the mail. She then in May 1944 became an Oberaufseherin, and she was given the task of commanding over 30,000 female prisoners in Birkenau's B-22C camp. She then in this role became infamous, and she would wear heavy boots and would carry her pistol and whip at all times. Grazer became known as a beautiful beast, or the blonde angel of hell, and she often wore expensive perfumes and tormented the women on a daily basis. One former doctor of Auschwitz described her as the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. Her face has an angelic clarity, and her blue eyes were the liveliest and most innocent eyes imaginable. Another said, it defied belief that such a pretty girl could be so cruel. When she walked through the camp with a whip in her hand, she was surrounded by a cloud of choice perfume. Grazer often stole valuables and clothing from the prisoners inside Auschwitz, but she would use her weapons to kill. She would use her whip to attack the women, and sometimes these injuries led to infections, which women would suffer. Doctors would then be forced to operate on the women with dirty equipment and no anaesthetics. She would then witness these operations, and it was said, Irma Grazer invariably arrived to watch the operation, kicking the victim if her screams interfered with her pleasure, and giving her completely the spasms which shook her entire body and made saliva run down the corner of her mouth. She was also known for shooting inmates at will whenever she liked it. But she also had dogs that she would use to strike fear into prisoners' hearts. During one incident, she was on a bicycle with her dog at the side of her, and any prisoner who could not keep up during a 16-kilometre walk to work was attacked by the canine. One witness of her actions involving the dog said, "We were loading the lorries. Before noon we had an unexpected visitor, Afsarin Irma, with her 2 leashed dogs. Frau Afsarin Irma, blonde, with an angel face and snake eyes, the camp's chief torturer. We were very careful not to attract her attention. We pushed and pushed. It seemed to take an eternity to roll the car over the hill. The next team was unable to coordinate its efforts. They were completely unnerved by our visitor. They hesitated and lost control of their wagon. It swayed, bowled down the hill, and capsized, scattering stone over the whole area. The prisoners were completely broken in spirit. Afsarin Irma set the 2 dogs on them. The girls tried to escape their fangs, but the trained killers easily overtook them. One grabbed a Polish woman which slipped on a rock. The other fell upon a Russian girl. At Irma's orders, the Carpo underlings beat and kicked the girls, still untouched by the dogs. The Carpo wrote down the numbers of the delinquent team. The dogs were tearing at the girls' bodies. Irma came closer to observe what they were doing. Her eyes were bloodshot. The sight of the blood seemed to intoxicate her. She panted. We stood in a trance, as if at a gladiatorial combat. Irma Grazer was also involved in the selection processes, and she would regularly decide with doctors such as Josef Mengele who would live and who would die. She even, it's believed, had an affair with Mengele, as well as other men and women, including female prisoners, and when she got bored of them she would send them to their deaths. Grazer did fall pregnant, and she forced the inmate doctor to perform a termination on her, and she even supplied the instruments required, and the doctor did perform this procedure. She did fall in love with an SS man though, Franz Wolfgang Haxinger, who was the chief engineer of Auschwitz I's construction element, and the pair would meet up in the evenings. But as the Second World War turned against the Germans, Irma Grazer's work at Auschwitz came to an end, as the camp was evacuated with the Red Army on the horizon. She was transferred to Ravensbrück briefly on the 18th of January 1945, but then in March 1945 she arrived at Bergen-Belsen. Belsen was a site in complete breakdown, as huge numbers of inmates were evacuated there, and she was reunited with many of her former colleagues of Auschwitz, such as Josef Kramer. Whilst at Belsen, Irma Grazer continued to be brutal, and she would force inmates to stand or kneel for long periods of time, and at roll call they had to hold rocks above their heads. They were forced to stand in the cold, and if someone struggled she would beat them with her truncheon. Even as the Allies were close by to liberating Belsen, she was still brutalising inmates. Irma Grazer remained at the camp as the Allies seized control, and she was there to allegedly maintain law and order. She had the chance to run, but decided against it. She was not immediately arrested and was forced to help bury the over 10,000 corpses that were lying around. She was then arrested on the 17th of April 1945, and many heard about her evil actions, and she was temporarily imprisoned in a Wehrmacht tank training academy nearby. She said, "It was our duty to exterminate antisocial elements so that Germany's future would be assured." Further interrogation went on, and she was then a few months later indicted with others on charges of execution, murder, ill-treatment and barbarism at Belsen and Auschwitz. She was brought to the Belsen trials, and during the trial it was said she was more bothered by her appearance than the charges that were brought against her. Throughout the trial she remained calm, and she remained unemotional when the evidence was put forward. Witnesses described seeing Irma Grazer shooting prisoners at point-blank range, and one said she was beaten by Grazer, and that some were even beaten to death. When the trial came to an end, Irma Grazer was sentenced to death alongside 2 other women, Elisabeth Volkenrath and Johanna Bormann. She was taken from her cell, and following this Grazer was known to be crying. She was then sent to Hamelin prison to await her execution, and it was Albert Pierpoint who would take her life. On the 13th of December 1945, Grazer was to face a hangman, and she was the second to die that day, as Elisabeth Volkenrath was to die first. It was said of her execution, "We climbed the stairs to the cells where the condemned were waiting. A German officer at the door leading to the corridor flung open the door, and we fired past a row of faces and into the execution chamber. The officers stood at attention. Brigadier Patton Walsh stood with his wristwatch raised. He gave me the signal, and a sigh of released breath was audible in the chamber. I walked into the corridor. Irma Grazer, I called. The German guards quickly closed all grills on 12 of the inspection holes and opened one door. Irma Grazer stepped out. The cell was far too small for me to go inside. I had to pinion her in the corridor. "Follow me," I said in English, and O'Neill repeated the order in German. At 9:34 a.m, she walked into the execution chamber, gazed at a moment for the officials standing round it, then walked into the centre of the trap, where I had made a chalk mark. She stood on this mark very firmly, and as I placed the white cap over her head, she said in her languid voice, "Schnell." The drop crashed down, and the doctor followed me into the pit and pronounced her dead. After 20 minutes, her body was taken down and placed in a coffin, ready for burial. Irma Grazer was one of the most notorious war criminals of the Second World War, and she was known for being a murderer and a brutal guard who was too happy to beat people with her whip and other weapons. She took many lives with her pistol and was sentenced to death for her crimes. After the end of the war, inside of Hungary, there were many executions that took place outside the Academy of Music in Budapest. This building became synonymous with the executions of former politicians who had plunged the country into a tragic and terrible war that saw the land closely allied with the Nazis. Hungarians would fight alongside German soldiers, and they would be rocked by huge deportations of people from their lands to concentration camps. The truth was that there were many politicians who became Prime Minister quickly and came within power, and they collaborated with the Nazis and with Hitler and Mussolini, and after the war, a number of these politicians, including Belarin Rady, were executed in Budapest, outside the Academy of Music. Thousands would flock to witness these executions and to see what they believed justice being carried out. However, what is the story of the woman who was executed inside of Budapest, in the same place it's believed as the former Prime Ministers? Maria or Manci Nagy was a World War II criminal who had been taken to a People's Tribunal or trial. These were held to deal with those who were accused of crimes against humanity and of causing huge suffering inside concentration camps. Those members of the army who committed atrocities were also tried in this way, and following her trial, Maria or Manci was then condemned to death. But what did she do? It's believed that as she was a Second World War war criminal, she was known for torturing young Jewish women. This leads to the possibility that she was actually a woman who worked inside of the concentration camps. There were many women who became guards for the SS inside of camps within the Third Reich, such as Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen, and a number of them were condemned for their crimes. But usually women like Irma Grazer were executed in private within prison cells and execution chambers, well away from the eyes of the public. The name associated with the condemned woman, Manci, is short for Margaret in Hungary, and what is strange is that little documented evidence, except from pictures and photographs, remain regarding her fate and execution. She is considered an unknown war criminal, and from the images it's clear that she is a woman who was rather elderly. She looks rather respectable and is wrapped in a sweater, but looks petrified as she makes her way to her execution. But there is another possibility as to why she was executed. In the final days of the Second World War in Hungary, there was large-scale killing and looting as the Soviet Red Army invaded and took city after city before moving to Budapest. It's possible that Manci was one of those who stole the property of displaced people, or that she attacked women who were already suffering. For her to be sentenced to death, it's clear she must have done something that was very, very serious. She could also have been someone who was a collaborator with the Germans and who passed information on to the Nazis, the Gestapo or the SS, about possibly the locations of Jewish women or prisoners. There were people who were paid to hunt Jews across Europe, and they acted off tip-offs from neighbours and local people to do this. Perhaps Mansi was one of those collaborators who were considered the lowest of the low inside of society. In Holland, there was one young woman who was executed for this crime, but she was deemed to have been a war criminal on the same level as the SS, who were deporting Jews to concentration camps. She was willingly giving over Jews to the enemy, and they would then be exterminated as soon as they arrived at sites such as Auschwitz. For Mansi Nagy to be executed in front of a crowd inside of Budapest, her offence and crime must have been incredibly serious and also shocking. The witnesses that day would have known that they were seeing the death of a war criminal. The events of her execution were in keeping with the executions of prominent Hungarians throughout the war. She was led out from her prison and was taken to an execution post and would be executed using the pole hanging method. With this, the noose was attached to a pole or a large wooden stake through a hook, which was then fed through an eyelet to the executioner, who was stood behind the condemned. When the wooden plank someone was standing on was removed, the executioner would pull on the noose and strangle the condemned against the pole. Death usually occurred in a few minutes. Maria or Mansi Nagy was accompanied by a priest who remained with her for her final moments, and the preparations for her execution were done by the executioner, who was wearing a suit and a hat, and also his assistant who helped him. These two, it's quite clear, were also the ones who performed the killing, and she would not be alone in her final moments. On the pole next to her was a white sheet in which a previously executed person was covered up in their final moments. This person would have been executed minutes before, and their body was then kept out of view of Mansi as she approached the stake. With her legs tied and her arms tied and the rope passed around her middle, she then climbed on top of the wooden box or step as the executioner fastened the noose and the rope around her neck. The step was then removed and she was left, and within minutes she was executed by the executioner. The story of Mansi or Maria Nagy is one which is shocking. What did this elderly woman do that was so offensive and evil that she would be taken in front of a crowd in Budapest and would be executed in public? Judging by the shape of the windows and the brickwork behind her, the execution must have occurred outside the Academy of Music, where former ministers and politicians were also executed. These sometimes were executed by a firing squad, however. Former Prime Minister Ferenc Selassie, who was one who was considered one of the country's worst war criminals, would be executed on the same stakes and in the same manner as this elderly woman. It's believed that she did and would have collaborated with the Nazis and Germans, and may have given up Jewish women who were hiding out, and they were then taken to extermination centres and were killed. But the sight of the elderly lady making her way to her death is one which has still puzzled historians, as we do not know too much about her crime. But the ageing lady in her sweater, in the eyes of the Hungarian officials and the witnesses and the people of Budapest, must at the time have deserved her execution for whatever she did. Maria Mandel was born in Austria in January 1912. She would become an active member in the Nazi movement within Austria, which at the time was banned. However, following the annexation of Austria, she joined the SS. Being a female member of the group, she would quickly find employment within the regime as a concentration camp guard. She would begin her employment at Lichtenberg, one of the earliest Nazi concentration camps in Saxony. She would work alongside 50 other SS women. Initially, the camp held male prisoners. However, between 1937 and 1939, it would house females. Many of the male prisoners who went before, political prisoners, were tortured and beaten to death by the SS guards. This savagery would continue as the prison changed to being a women's camp. Many women were beaten to death, and 2 women who tried to escape were ripped to pieces by the dogs on the orders of the camp's commandant. Maria would begin working here in October 1938, and the following year there was further change. Along with the guards and prisoners, Maria Mandel was sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp near to Berlin. This camp had just been set up, and she began to work here as a supervisor on the first day it opened. Ravensbrück was a camp specifically for women, and as the Nazis would conquer more land and territory, the numbers inside the camp would grow. Maria Mandel, from the start of her work as a guard, gained a horrific reputation for immense cruelty. Heinrich Himmler would visit in 1940, and he allowed the guards to use punishment such as flogging. Mandel would often be the one who would dish out the brutal floggings and whippings. This could have been as few as 10 to 25 lashes for less serious offences. However, some prisoners were lashed up to 75 times. This was so barbaric that the lashes had to be even given in instalments, as death was a distinct possibility. Mandel was so obsessed with inflicting pain that many of the prisoners had to be revived for their punishment to continue, losing consciousness, such was the pain. Bodies would become blue with bruises, and many were afflicted for life. Maria impressed her superiors and was promoted in April 1942, becoming the head supervisor of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Birkenau was the extermination camp of the Auschwitz complex, and during the Holocaust and the Final Solution, it was used as the main centre for killing Jews and other minorities, which went against the Nazis' racial laws. She replaced Johanna Langerfeld as the commander of the women's camp, who had previously fallen out with Rudolf Höss. Mandel's intelligence and devotion to the Nazi cause is what led to her promotion. She would preside over the women's camp with terror, and would earn the nickname the Beast. The brutal and horrific punishments and beatings would continue. She would also take part in the selections, playing God with the lives of the prisoners inside Auschwitz. Jews who were not fit enough to work would have been sent straight to the gas chambers in these selections, and it would be Mandel who would decide this. From selection to death would be a mere matter of minutes, and in this way she sent dozens of thousands to their deaths. Many of the female prisoners chosen by Mandel would also have to submit to barbaric, degrading, and often deadly medical experiments carried out by SS doctors such as Josef Mengele. Some of the women selected by Maria would become the test subjects for these experiments. After the war, at her trial, the court would hear of many of these horrific experiments. Testimonies would tell how hundreds of women had been sterilised by X-rays and forcibly had their ovaries removed for further examination before they were sent to their death inside the gas chambers. It would also be told how children were sometimes just left to freeze to death in the winter at the camp, and also how Mandel forced thousands of women to stand to attention in their bare feet in the snow. These women collapsed in the freezing temperature and also suffered from hypothermia. They were then ordered to run back to the barracks, and those who could not do so were sent to their deaths. When hearing this, Mandel responded at trial that she had always cared for the prisoners' well-being. Other accounts would tell how she would have a number of liaisons with large groups at her furnished villa near to Auschwitz. These parties were huge episodes of debauchery, and often occurred when Mandel wanted to celebrate after administering torture. Mandel would take part in selections for over 2 years, and it's estimated that 500,000 women and children were sent to their deaths by Mandel's actions in Auschwitz. She would also establish within the camp an orchestra. She was a fan of music, and instead of cleaning toilets and completing horrendous hard labour, a privileged group of women were forced to perform in an orchestra. This consisted of a couple of violins, cello, guitars, accordions and other instruments. The orchestra was even conducted, and they played marches whilst women arrived at the camp. It was said that the women who came back from work exhausted had to march in time to the music. Music was ordered for all occasions, for the addresses of the camp commanders, for the transports, and whenever anyone was hanged. As Auschwitz was liberated by the Red Army, Maria Mandel was nowhere to be found. She had left the camp in late 1944, being assigned to a subcamp of Dachau. With the Allies and the Red Army liberating different camps, exposing the horrors of the Nazi regime, Mandel fled into the mountains of southern Bavaria. She was arrested on the 10th of August 1945 by the US Army and was interrogated. During this process it was found that she was very intelligent and was devoted to her work in the mass extermination of the Jews. She was held at Dachau prison for a period of time and was then handed over to the Polish People's Republic before being tried in the Auschwitz trials. When hearing the testimonies from the sufferers of Mandel's cruelty, she would sit with her head bent. Along with a number of other guards, she was found guilty of the horrendous crimes she had committed within Auschwitz and was sentenced to death as a war criminal. Whilst awaiting her execution, it was said that she did ask for forgiveness for her crimes. On the 28th of January 1948, inside Krakow prison, which had been one of the worst Nazi prisons in Poland, along with 20 other condemned, Maria Mandel was hanged. She was the first of the group to be executed, being female. At 7:09 a.m, the hangings would commence inside of the execution chamber. Maria, along with 4 male prisoners, was made to climb a simple step, then they had the noose placed around their neck. The step was then removed, and the former Auschwitz guard was slowly strangled to death. It was reported that it took 15 minutes for all of the first group, including Maria Mandel, to be certified dead within. Maria Mandel was someone who was familiar with the gallows and executions, and it was fitting that her end would come with the hangman's noose. She was an incredibly brutal and barbaric woman, and would oversee the deaths of almost 500,000 people within Auschwitz. This is a sadistic figure, considering she had a role in sending 500,000 people to their deaths within the gas chambers. She certainly got what was coming to her, and her execution was a justified one.